pleasure to introduce her, but wanted to take an opportunity to say thanks to all of you for being here and for all that you do day in and day out. Let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Haycock. As I'd mentioned, there was a conference, I think another example that there are a lot of people from around the state interested in education. We're privileged to have her back to New Mexico. If you have not heard her yet, believe me, you're in for a treat. She has a lot of passion for what she does. What I particularly like about what I've heard is that much of her opinion and much of her passion is based on data. I'm one of those show me kind of people. I respect when people have opinions, but it's always great to have the data behind that, and I think that's what you'll see and hear today. She is currently president of Ed Trust, a national organization with a mission of closing the achievement gap for all students, specifically those from low-income families and minorities. And certainly that's important to all of us that live in this state, and we're anxious to hear what she has to say. She's received numerous awards for her service on behalf of our nation's youth and serves as director on several education-related boards, including the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching, the New Teacher Project, and the Hunt Institute. She, again, is no stranger to New Mexico. I don't know how many times you've been here, Dr. Haycock, but we're glad to have you back. She's dedicated her talents and efforts toward understanding the unique circumstances that New Mexico students face. I was impressed when she came last time how much she knew about our state, and I'm sure she'll impress us again today. She's an advocate for our children and supporting education reform. She speaks about education improvement before thousands of educators and community business leaders and policymakers each year. We're lucky to have her here today. Let's welcome back Dr. Kati Haycock.
So, yeah, I was in your hometown actually just a couple of weeks ago, and this one is a lot easier to get to, thank you. So, good morning to all of you. I am delighted to join you at your annual budget conference this morning. You know, one of the things that I know from working in education for a very long time is that at this time of year, it is very easy, whether you're thinking about just getting through a legislative session or just getting through a school year, it is very easy to just lose sight of why you're doing all this hard work to begin with. So my role with you this morning is to kind of drag you outside of what you do every single day and talk with you about sort of what we do and why we do it. But most important, about why what we do and how well we do it is so hugely important to both our children, but also to the very future of our state and certainly our country. And I'm going to do that, excuse me, by dragging you through a whole lot of data that will help us look together about what happens to different groups of kids in this country as they take the journey from kindergarten toward college. We'll talk a little bit about where New Mexico kids sit within that larger context. We'll talk about some of the patterns and problems that you see in the data, but most of all, what I want to do is reinforce for you what many of you already know, and that is, what is it we can do right now to tackle some of the problems that you see in the data head on and get better results? So what, in other words, can we learn from the best schools and school districts, both here in New Mexico and elsewhere around the country, about what it's going to take to both raise overall achievement, but also to close once and for all these gaps between groups that have haunted us as a country for so long. So 2 quick words about the data before I begin. Number 1, you will note that the data are not always full for every group of kids, and especially for Native children. I will just note that and apologize for it in advance. We're subject to the limits of the way the federal government unfortunately collects its data, but I will show you whatever we have for every group of kids so you can hopefully see the particular kids you're worried about throughout this presentation. And secondly, I know that especially in conferences called budget conferences, there tend to be people in the room who like numbers and who love to write them down. So just know in advance that I will go way too fast for you to do that. But what we will do is we'll post this presentation on our website and if we can on the PED website afterwards, and we'll show you how to get there at the end. So just know in advance you don't have to worry about writing all the numbers down. So before I walk you through the data, though, again, I want to sort of pull you out and talk about why all of this is so important. I guess why that's not going to work. Okay.
Just a tab button, the space bar.
Which one? The space bar? Okie doke. So, as Americans, as I think all of you know, we have told each other in the world two very important stories about who we are as a country. The first one, of course, is that we're the land of opportunity. That whether your parents were born in a village in India or in the hollers of western Kentucky, that this is the place. The United States is the place above all others where if you work hard, you can become anything you want to be. The second story that we've told each other in the world is one of constant intergenerational improvement. That each generation of American parents, through hard work and savings, can assure its children a better education and, in fact, a better life. Those stories, as you know, are very powerful. They have animated the hopes and the dreams of millions of people here at home, and of course, they have drawn countless immigrants to our shores. Now, America, of course, was built on the backs of hardworking people like these. And they knew, of course, that America was often intolerant of people who looked like them or who struggled with English like them. And they knew that the American dream was, at best, a work in progress. But they were proud, oh so proud of the country that they were building. We were, as you know, the first to provide universal high school education, the first to build public universities, the first to build community colleges, and the first to broaden access to college, first through the GI Bill and subsequently through Pell Grants. And gradually, over time, those efforts paid off big time in advancing education levels, both at the high school level and at the college level. Opportunities expanded outward. And we know, everybody in this room knows, that sometimes the progress was painfully slow, especially for people of color. But as you can see in the slides in front of you, over time, even there too, education levels advanced upwards, opportunities expanded outward, and we began to pave the path to upward mobility. It's important to know that beginning about 1980, though, those patterns began to slow down and in some cases to turn around again, with inequality actually growing. You certainly know that earnings in the last 10 or 20 years among those at the top of the income ladder have actually grown exponentially, while those at the bottom of the income ladder have actually declined. Now, in fact, instead of being among the most equal nations on earth, the United States is now among the most unequal developed nations on earth, with the third highest income inequality among all of the developed countries. It's not just about income that we're seeing inequalities, but growing differences in family wealth as well. The median income of white families in this country is now 20 times that of African Americans and 18 times that of Latinos. Importantly, though, it is not just growing inequality in wages and growing inequality in wealth, but declining economic mobility as well. Now, in fact, instead of being the developed country on earth where if you're born into poverty, it is easiest, if you work hard, to have a better life than the ones your parents had, we are now tied with the United Kingdom for being the developed country on earth where it is hardest, if you're born poor, to have a better or easier life than the ones your parents had. Ironically, it is now easier if you're born poor in Canada to realize the American dream than if you're born poor here in the United States of America. Now, when you think about those overall patterns, you know, because you're educated folks, that better and more equal education is not the only thing that needs to change in order to turn those patterns around and head us back to delivering on the principles on which we were founded. There are a lot of important things. Sorry. There are a lot of things that enlightened public policy both could and should do. But at the individual level, of course, quality education literally is the only way up. As generations on generations of African American parents have taught their children, a good education is the only thing that nobody can ever take away from you. What that tells us is that what we do in our schools and in our colleges is hugely important. It's not only important to the future of our economy, though it clearly is that, but it is also important to the future of our democracy and to, again, returning our country to the principles that all of us hold dear. So if how we're doing is important, the question is, how are we doing? And I want to start actually with some very good news. Those of you who know the national data probably know that it was a while since we had good news. During the 1970s and 80s, we actually made a lot of progress as a country in raising achievement, especially for low-income kids and kids of color. But right around 1990, that progress literally stopped dead in its tracks. And all throughout the 1990s, the gaps between different groups of kids were actually growing wider. So here's the good news. What you're looking at here is reading achievement over time by group. As you can see, in the last 10 years, we're seeing sharp improvements for all groups of kids, record performance for all groups of kids, and the smallest gap separating both black children from white children and Latino children from white children that we've ever had in this country's history. So very good news in fourth grade reading. There's good news too, as you can see here in fourth grade math, where again we're seeing sharp improvements for all groups of kids, especially fast improvements for kids of color, and the smallest gaps between groups that we've ever had in this country's history. When you look at the data a little bit differently, and on the so-called main NAEP exam, again you see the same pattern, and you can see here the data for Native children as well. And just to give you a little bit different look, because sometimes when you just see the lines, and you're looking at sort of average achievement, it's hard to imagine what do those actually mean for the kids involved. These data show you a little bit more clearly. What you're looking at there up on the screen is fourth grade math performance back in 1996. And just a quick clue to what you're seeing. Wherever you see red, those are the kids about whom we need to worry a lot. They're performing at the below basic level. That means they're not even close to having the knowledge and skills we all know they need to succeed in the years ahead. Green kids are doing just fine by contrast. They're proficient or advanced, yellow someplace in between. So let's look at African American Latino youngsters. Back in 1996, roughly 3/4 of African American kids and slightly under 2/3 of Latino kids were performing at that dangerous below basic level, only 3% and 7% respectively at the proficient or advanced level. So let's fast forward to today. As you can see, the numbers in that dangerous red category more than reduced by half. Meanwhile, roughly 6 times as many at those highest proficient levels. Again, showing you the huge progress that's been made, especially in the last 10 or 12 years of effort. When you look up at the middle grades, as many of you know, the results are a little less strong, but generally in the same pattern as well. That's a look at reading achievement over time, and here's a look at math achievement at the end of middle school over time. Again, we're seeing strong improvement, more improvement among kids of color than among white students, and the smallest gaps we've ever seen. The bottom line, again, no matter how you look at the data, is very clear. When we really focus on something as a country, when we focus on something as a profession, the fact of the matter is we make progress. And those of you who have had a chance to study the history of American education certainly know that if there's one message from our history, it's actually that one. When we really focus on something, we make progress. Now, In focusing on the progress at the elementary and middle school level, I don't want to suggest that there's not a lot that remains to be done. Anybody today who's working at the high school level is very much aware there's still a lot of kids who are entering high school without even close to the knowledge and skills we know they need to succeed there. And you see that very clearly when you look at these data on 8th graders at the end of 8th grade. That's a look at what the numbers look like in math. Here's what they look like in reading. So again, we still got some work to do, but at least we have some traction on those problems. When you look at successive years of data on kids completing elementary school and moving up, completing middle school and moving up, what we're seeing is fewer and fewer kids in that red category, more and more kids in that green category, which tells us we have some traction on that problem. Unfortunately, the same is not true of results in our high schools. What you're looking at there are reading achievement results at the end of high school over time. As you can see, that line is not headed in the direction we like it to head. What that's telling us is that kids today are exiting high school with weaker skills in reading than their counterparts had 25 years ago. And when you turn over to mathematics, the results, as you can see, are not much different. A little bit of improvement in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but flat or declining since that time. And those gaps between groups that I showed you narrowing at the elementary school level and narrowing at the middle school level, not at the high school level. As you can see here in both reading and in math, the gap separating both poor kids from middle-class kids and kids of color from white kids are basically the same today as they were back in 1990. Moreover, no matter how you cut the international data, our kids are not doing well compared to their counterparts in other countries. As many of you know, there's an exam called PISA that is administered to 15-year-olds across the developed world, and the most recent results give us some reason to worry. Among the 34 countries where 15-year-olds took that exam in 2012, our 15-year-olds ranked 17th out of 34 in reading, 20th out of 34 in science, and in mathematics, which is the driver of future economic development, our 15-year-olds ranked 27th out of 34 in the developed world. In fact, the only place that we rank high as a country in international rankings is probably not some place we're very proud of ranking high, because it's the inequality of our results. Despite the principles on which we were founded as a country, we actually have the 4th largest gap between high and low-income kids in science, the 5th largest gap between high and low-income kids in science, and in mathematics, the only reason we don't have a gap that's as high as other countries is because our rich kids don't do so well either. Not much to brag about. So let's talk about those gaps. All of you certainly know that when you look at your data, whether you're looking at data for your school district, you're looking at data for your state, or you're looking at data for the country, and you see gaps between different groups of kids, you know what we all know. And that is some of that began before kids even arrive at the schoolhouse door. All of us certainly know that in this state, and certainly in our country as a whole, there are a lot of kids every year who arrive at school already behind. Sometimes that's because of poverty, sometimes that's because of language issues, sometimes that's a result of family stress, but regardless of reason, a significant number of kids arrive at school already behind. So, okay, we know that. The question is, okay, knowing that, how do we organize our educational system in response? And what you'll learn when you look honestly at that question is that rather than organizing our educational system in this country to ameliorate that problem, we actually organize our educational system in this country to exacerbate that problem. How do we do that? We do that very simply. We take the kids who come to school with less, and we turn around and we give them less in school too. In fact, it turns out that we take the kids who arrive at school behind, and we give them less of everything. And I mean everything. that both research and experience tells us makes a difference. And then when they don't perform so well on standardized tests, who do we blame it on? We blame it on the kids, we blame it on their parents, we blame it on their race, we blame it on their culture. We actually never, ever talk about what we did. So how, you ask, does that happen in the United States of America? Well, some of the lessons in the education of poor children and children of color flow from choices that other people make. And that includes the choice that some state policymakers make to just spend less on the education of some children than they spend on the education of others. And what you're looking at there up on the screen shows how those choices made by policymakers play out in the country as a whole. So again, some of these lessons are a function of choices that other people make about who's worth investing in, education-wise that is, and who's just a little bit less worthy. Now, most of the educators I know don't approve of that choice, and in many states, educators have joined others to work very hard to convince state legislatures to put into place fairer and more equitable finance systems. But at least in my experience, though most educators wouldn't vote that way if they were state policymakers, there are many in our profession who actually take a little comfort in that choice. And why might that be? Because, once again, it makes the achievement gap not about us, right? It makes it about those policymakers, or once again, about the children and their parents. But the truth of the matter is that most of the most devastating lessons in the education of poor children and children of color flow not from the choices that the policymakers make, but rather from the choices that we educators make. Choices we make, for example, about what to expect of whom. No policymaker in America made us do that. Choices that we make about what to teach to whom. No policymaker in America made us do this either, or this, or this. And then, of course, there's the most devastating choice that we make of all, and that is the choice of who teaches whom, where no matter how you measure it, poor children and children of color are far more likely than other children to be taught by inexperienced teachers, to be taught by teachers who aren't teaching the subject that they were trained to teach in college, or where we actually have the data, to be taught by teachers who are actually effective at producing gains in student learning. When you add up both sets of lessons, both the lessons that flow from choices that policymakers make and the lessons that flow from choices that we educators make, the results are simply devastating. Kids who arrive at our doors about this much behind are actually leaving us about this much behind. The gap, in other words, that separates both poor kids from middle-class kids and kids of color from white kids actually grows wider and wider and wider the longer they remain with us in school. And these, of course, are the kids who remain with us in school. Though you are clearly making some progress on this in New Mexico, there are still a significant number of kids, both here and elsewhere in the country, who don't even make it to that 12th grade year. Add those numbers up and throw in college entry and college graduation rates, and what you end up with is very different rates of degree acquisitions for different groups of young Americans. For every 100 white children we start with in our kindergartens nationally, somewhere around 89 or 90 end up with a high school diploma or GED. And of those, roughly 39 or 40 end up with at least a bachelor's degree. For African American students, the BA rates are 1/2 those of white students. For Hispanics, they are only 1/3. And when you look at the data by family income, even more devastating differences still. If you look right now at American families in the top quartile of family income. Those are families with a household incomes about $80,000 a year or above. Look at their children around age 24, 25. What you'll learn, as you can see on the screen, is roughly 79 or 80 out of 100 already have at least a bachelor's degree. But if you look, on the other hand, at American families in the bottom economic quartile, those are families like many here in New Mexico, where the household income is only $30,000 a year or below. Look at their children at that same age. What you'll learn, as you can see there, is only about 1 out of 9 have that same bachelor's degree. And we're asked all the time, well, what are you trying to suggest there? And the answer is really pretty straightforward. What the data suggest is that unless you and I are somehow prepared to argue that children from upper middle and upper income families are more than 7 times as smart as children of the poor, this is about as clear a signal that we have that something's going quite seriously wrong in these two systems of ours, K-12 and higher education, because that is precisely the result we're now getting at the end of the line. More than 7 times the results for children from upper middle and upper income families that we're getting for children of the poor. Now, you don't have to think about those numbers very long to know that if we don't change those numbers, they will tear away at the very health of our democracy. But even frankly, for people who don't care about that, who don't care about the health of our democracy or about social mobility or social cohesion, you gotta worry about those numbers given who is growing in this country and who is not. And when you add those two patterns up, you begin to understand why our longtime international leadership in terms of the post-secondary education levels of our adults are fast slipping away. As I mentioned earlier, we were the first in the world to broaden access to college and to do so as aggressively as we did following World War II. But you know what? All the other countries around the world looked at what that did for us, the enormous growth of this very prosperous middle class, and they said, we want that too. So they took our playbook and they played it out faster and more effectively than we did. Now, as a result of the fact that we got going ahead of them, we still rank pretty high in the developed world. We used to be number 1. We still rank pretty high when you look at our overall adult population, 4th now in the developed world. And that's the rate of our adults that have at least an associate's degree. But when you look at our young adults, that ranking falls from 4th to 15th in the developed world. And perhaps most frightening of all, we are one of only 2 countries in the developed world today where today's young adults are not significantly better educated than their parents. And as all of you know, this is the first generation in American history where that's been true. So that's essentially a quick sketch of where we are as a country. The question, of course, is, okay, if that's where we're at, what can we do about all that? You know, one of the things that's terribly important to acknowledge in rooms like this one is that there's a whole lot of people in this country, including a whole lot of educators, who basically don't think there's anything we can do about the numbers that I just showed you. How do we know that? Well, we spend a lot of time as an organization sharing data with audiences of educators and others around the country. And sometimes, especially with the educator groups, rather than go on with the why part, we just turn off the computer, shut down the projector, and turn to them and say, okay, you've seen the data. Tell us what's going on here. Here's what we've learned. No matter where we are in the country, they make exactly the same list. They say, what do you expect? The kids are poor. Their parents don't care. They come to school without an adequate breakfast. They don't have enough books at home. They don't have a quiet place to study at home. They live in difficult neighborhoods. They don't have enough parents. A whole list of reasons, in other words, that is always, always, and only about the kids and their parents. But our question back to them is a pretty simple one, and that is, but wait a second here. If you're right, if, in other words, things like poverty or difficult home circumstances cause low achievement, If those things make low achievement inevitable, how then can it be that very poor kids and kids of color are performing so high in some places? How can that be? So we don't have a lot of time for examples, but I want to give you a few, and I want to start in Mobile, Alabama. I don't know how many people in this room have visited Mobile recently, but if you visited downtown Mobile, you would see what looks like a very successful southern city. That is not what you would think if you visited the neighborhood that George Hall serves. George Hall is located in the poorest neighborhood in Mobile County. Its student population, as you can see, is virtually all African American, and 99% of the kids, frankly, aren't just low income. These are very, very poor kids. This is a neighborhood that has been racked by gun and drug violence for decades. Few of the parents are employed. Most of them live in government housing. This, in other words, is a very, very challenged population. And it won't surprise you to know that this school for a very long time was the lowest performing school in Mobile County and one of the 10 lowest performing schools in all of Alabama. And the president of the school board told me a few years ago, he said, you know, every year we get the data from the state and we sit around at the board level and we look at the data and we'd look at the George Hall numbers and we'd shake our heads and we'd feel really bad about the numbers. He said, usually for about 20 minutes, because that's about how long it took somebody to say, you know, what do you expect? Look at the parents, look at the neighborhood, what do you expect? And he said, like boards everywhere, we just accepted that and we went back to business as usual. But one year, under the pressure of kind of public embarrassment and, frankly, state accountability, they decided to take the performance at this school much more seriously. They identified a principal from elsewhere in the district, a woman by the name of Terry Tomlinson, who was a first-rate, proven veteran, and they asked Terry to take over responsibility at this school. But they also made everybody in the school reapply for their jobs. And Terry told us, she said, you know, I didn't rehire a single administrator, not one. I didn't rehire a single teacher either, not one of them. Not because none of them could be good, but because over time something had happened at that school, this kind of oozing miasma of low expectations had set in and essentially taken that school down. Nobody could see their way through that, and expectations both of the kids and frankly of themselves had just fallen through the floor. She said, what I needed was teachers who, when they looked into the eyes of the children, saw future nurses, future doctors, future firemen, future business people, but when they looked into the eyes of the kids, they just saw future drug dealers, future thugs. So that school was restaffed. The educators who left that building weren't very happy about leaving it, because while these are sometimes awful places to work, because of that kind of oozing low expectation, they are also sometimes comfortable places to work for people who don't want to work very hard. So those who left were not very happy, and they took it out on their successors by rubbing the halls of the school with dead fish and stuffing dead cats in the ventilation system. You can imagine, given the heat in Mobile, what that school was like when the adults returned to the building in August. But let me be clear, nothing about that deterred the educators in that school from the mission that they were on, because they know what you know, and that is for children who lead lives this tough and this challenging, what you do in school represents the only chance that these kids have to live their lives not out there on the margins where their parents were forced to live, but in the mainstream. So every minute counts. This is a school that is incredibly well organized around everything to do with teaching and learning. They don't waste a single minute. And just to give you one example of how that manifests itself, this is a school where the educators really, for example, believe in field trips. because they know what you know, and that is for kids whose lives are so circumscribed by poverty and by neighborhoods, it's really important to get them up and out to see stuff, to open their eyes to other possibilities. But boy, on the bus going to the field trip, they are doing vocabulary related to what they're going to see all the way there, and they are doing math problems all the way back. They don't lose a minute. And let me show you what their results look like. Those are results in fourth grade reading. Again, back in 2004, one of the lowest performing schools in the state, now consistently among the highest performing schools in the state. And by the way, if I showed you that last slide, the principal would say, don't show them the proficiency rates, because our test isn't tough enough. Show them the advanced rates, because that's what they focus on. What you're seeing on the screen on the left-hand side shows you George Hall's rates, fifth grade math, at the advanced level. As you can see, 97% of these children hit the advanced level in the state assessment. Compared on the right-hand bar, what you're seeing is white children in the state of Alabama. Only 2/3 get there. Same kids, same parents, vastly different results. Don't let anybody ever tell you that what schools do doesn't matter. What schools do matters big time, and not just in Alabama. Welcome to Hallie Hewitson Elementary School, Las Vegas, Nevada. Hallie Hewitson serves a student population much like many here in New Mexico. 85% of the students are Latino, roughly all of them from low-income families. About 3/4 are limited English proficient. This school had a little different challenge. The school had a fine set of teachers, but they never got any training in what to do with English language learners. So they just made it up for themselves, and frankly, when you make it up for yourselves, it doesn't always work. So they struggled at the bottom of the state's performance list for many years until they got a principal who actually had real expertise in how to serve English language learners and systematically built that in her existing team. She also had another expertise, though, that really proved important, and that was in knowing how to build real bridges to parents in that community. Because what she knew from experience was what many of you have learned as well, but we don't talk about very much, and that is even parents whose own education levels are very limited, even parents who themselves have not mastered the English language, can be very powerful partners with schools in getting their kids to higher levels of achievement if we make them active partners and help them to learn how they can reinforce what's going on at school. So take a look at their progress. Again, back in 2004, one of the lowest performing schools in the state, now consistently among the highest performing schools in the state, consistently, by the way, outperforming even schools serving affluent kids. That was the reading numbers, what you're seeing here in math. Hallie Hewitson compared to all other elementary schools in Nevada. That principal, too, would say, don't show them the proficiency numbers, show them the advanced numbers. Look at these. Roughly 2/3 of their third graders hit the advanced level on the state assessment, compared to fewer than 1/3 in Nevada as a whole. Again, same kids, same parents, same neighborhood, very different approach to instruction, one where the educators in this building don't ever say things like, we taught it, they just didn't learn it. They don't ever say we taught it until the kids actually mastered it. They are absolutely methodical about everything that has to do with teaching and learning. Calcidever Elementary School in Mount Vernon, Alabama, again a school that serves children much like those here in New Mexico. In this case, American Indian children, also from low-income families. This school, too, once one of the lowest schools in the state, now consistently among the highest achieving in the state, and not just in hitting proficiency. 80% of the children in this school, again, virtually all of whom are native children, virtually all of whom are growing up in low-income households, are hitting the advanced level on the state assessment. And by the way, it's not just elementary and middle schools. Welcome to Elmont Memorial Junior Senior High School in the state of New York. Elmont, I can't go backwards on this, so Elmont serves about 2,000 kids in grades 7 to 12. Their student population is largely Latino and African American. About 9 years ago, they had a new principal arrive, a gentleman by the name of Al Harper. And Al said, the first day of showing up at work at this school as principal was quite fascinating. He said, I walked up the front steps of the school. I was greeted at the front door by my 2 assistant principals who said, welcome, Mr. Harper, to one of the best minority high schools in the state of New York. Al said, as a black man, I said to myself, what the heck does that mean? One of the best minority high schools in the state of New York? Why aren't we one of the best high schools in the state of New York? And that is actually what they set out to become. Now, Al was one heck of a leader. He's now the superintendent of the elementary district that feeds this school. And his successor as a principal, a gentleman by the name of John Capozzi, is also a terrific leader. But let me be clear here. The real leaders of instructional improvement at this high school are the department chairs, the teacher leaders, in fact. This school has one of the most fabulous sets of academic department chairs of any high school, or I would argue actually any college in the country. These teachers care so much about the quality of teaching that goes on, not just in their own classroom, but in every classroom in their department. They think about almost nothing else. In fact, when you visit that school, what you see are department chairs constantly strategizing together. How can we improve things this much more? Where do we go for more help? They're going out to get training both in content and in working with adults. They're taking teams out, bringing teams in. It is an absolute machine around improving instruction every single day. And in fact, just to give you one example of how that plays out, at Elmont, when a new teacher comes, in addition to the observations of that new teacher by the principal and the assistant principals, the department chairs make a minimum of 8 one-hour unscheduled observations year 1 and year 2. Moreover, among them, they have such a finely honed understanding of what they should be able to expect of new teachers semester 1, what they should help them to be able to do by semester 2, semester 3, semester 4, and so on, that my team at least is convinced that even teachers who would be merely ordinary in other places actually manage to become superstars at this school. And again, let's take a look at their results. These are their results on the New York Regents English exam compared to all other high schools in New York State. These are their results on the New York Regents Math exam compared to all other high schools in New York State. And just to give you a sense of, yes, no, they're not doing this by pushing kids out before graduation. Take a look at their graduation rates compared to all other high schools in New York State. So once again, whether you're talking about elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, don't let anybody ever tell you that what they do doesn't matter. It's all about kids or parents or poverty or language. It turns out that what schools do matters big time. And those of you who want to read more about these schools, there's 3 books that have been written on them now that just really walk you through some of the lessons from those schools, which are immediately exportable elsewhere. But let me be clear here. One of the things that we have come to understand is that there's a lot of people in our profession who, like, when they see data like this, they say, yeah, okay, we know you at Trust people, you have your fabulous, high-performing, high-poverty schools. But those are the flukes, right? The freaks, the outlier schools, the schools that exist on the sheer force of some principal's personality. We could never do that at scale. In the end, they say, this is really about the kids. And what we've been trying to figure out, what's in people's heads when they say things like that? What we've come to understand is there are a fair number of people in this profession of ours who walk around with the idea in their heads that group performance is just kind of monolithic. In their mind, African American kids perform sort of here, Hispanic kids perform sort of like them, sometimes a little better, sometimes a little worse, and white and Asian kids, at least in their minds, perform just up here. So what people like this think, and again, there are many of them in our profession, is that your performance as a school district, or frankly, even as a whole state, is just mostly a function of how many of each group you get. That's what they think. The group performance is basically monolithic. It turns out that's not even close to true. There are whopping difference in the performance of these so-called same group of kids across districts and across whole states. Let me give you one example of that. What you're looking at here is 8th grade math performance just among Latino students. These are in the largest school districts that participate in the so-called TUDA exam. And what do you see? The district on the left-hand side, which is where Latinos are performing the highest in 8th grade math, that's Houston. District on the right-hand side, where Latinos are performing the lowest, that's Fresno. The gap you're looking at in performance there, that's not the gap you're used to looking at. In other words, that's not the Latino-white gap. That is the gap between the performance of Latinos in one district and Latinos in another. Just to give you a sense of its size, almost 3 full grade levels. In other words, by 8th grade, Latinos in Houston are outperforming their counterparts in Fresno by almost 3 full grade levels. You see the same difference when you look at data for African Americans here, 8th grade math, Boston on the left, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Fresno on the right. That gap also roughly 3 full grade levels. And again, let's be clear here. We are not talking about minor, statistically significant but meaningless distinctions. 2 or 3 grade levels of difference is a life-changing difference. So don't let anybody ever tell you that kids just perform the same no matter where they go to school, because that's not even close to true. It is also not even close to true when you look at things like improvement. What you're looking at here is improvement in 8th grade math for Latinos over the last 10 years. Now the good news is nationally up about 11 points. What that means is that Latino 8th graders today are performing roughly where 9th graders were when all this got started a decade ago. That's good news. But look by contrast at the progress made in these districts. In Houston and Boston, almost twice as much progress as in the country as a whole. You see the same difference when you look at data for for African Americans, up 10 points in the country as a whole, but up twice that in Atlanta and Boston. So again, don't let anybody ever tell you it's just about the kids or just about their parents and their poverty. It turns out that at every level of education, at the school level, at the district level, and in fact at the state level, what we do actually matters. What you do every day actually matters. So what do the data tell us about where New Mexico sits in all this? Let me walk you through. Again, what you're looking at here looks complicated at the beginning. It's actually not. State on the left is doing the best. State on the right is doing the worst. The difference between best and worst is typically between 2 and 3 grade levels. So what this shows you is every state, all kids in every state in 4th grade reading. Where's New Mexico? Right down there, okay? Next to the bottom. Now I know that the tendency is to say, well, yeah, but that's because we're more diverse, or we have more poverty. But the reality is, no matter what group you look at, New Mexico doesn't look much different. So this is white performance, state by state, whereas New Mexico, right there. Latino performance in every state, whereas New Mexico, right there. American Indian performance in every state, whereas New Mexico, there. Low-income kids, New Mexico, here. What about high-income kids? New Mexico, there. So no matter which way you cut the data, when you talk about early reading, and you all know how important early reading is, right? Doesn't look so good. Let's look up at 8th grade math. Again, this is all kids, all states. New Mexico kids here. Let's break the data apart. White children here. Latinos here. American Indian students here. Low income here. High income here. Now, the good news is what you see when you do what we do, which is not just look at where states are, but at what their trajectories look like over time. What you begin to see is a result of the hard work that's been going on here over many of the last 10 years. So when you look at rank based on performance, as you saw, a lot of your numbers are down in the 40s. But when you look at your rank based on improvement, it looks much better. For all students, 14th out of 50 states. For white students, 21st out of 50 states. For African Americans, 18th. For Latinos, 15th. For low income, 21st. For higher income, 19. So again, what you're beginning to see is the momentum you're establishing, which, as you know, will pay off later on in terms of improved results. That was 4th grade reading. This is 8th grade math, where again your trajectory is even stronger with improvement for all kids, 6th out of 50th in the country. For Latino kids, 9th out of 36 states with measurable Latino improvement. 5th for low-income kids and 5th for high-income kids. Again, showing that your hard work is paying off in strong improvement. And as Jim Hunt said once many years ago when he took over the governorship of North Carolina, if we are number one in improvement long enough, we will eventually be number one in achievement. And that's probably the most important way to think about all of this. Now, when you look up at high school completion and readiness for college and career, as you know, those numbers are cause for worry, although strong improvement in recent years, which is good news. When you look at college readiness, especially when you look at the data by race, reason to worry, reason to get busy, with numbers especially among your American Indian students, particularly worrisome. But it's not just college-bound students. You have a fair number of students here in New Mexico who want careers in the military. Look at what happens to them when they try to pass the Armed Forces qualifying test. Huge numbers in New Mexico, Army applicants who want to serve their country are denied the ability to do that because they cannot pass the test that is required for entry into the Army. What happens when you look up at the college numbers? When you look up at the college-going numbers of your high school graduates, they look actually quite nice, in the top quarter of the country. Reason to feel good. But when you ask a different question, which is, okay, well, how many of our 9th graders actually end up graduating from high school and going on to college? You shift from top quarter of the country to bottom quarter of the country because of that high school graduation rate. And unfortunately, very few of those who enter actually complete, with graduation rates here in New Mexico, both worrisome for kids of color, but worrisome for other students as well. Among those who start in 4-year colleges here in New Mexico, about third lowest degree acquisition rate of any state in the country, with only Alaska and Arizona doing worse. Among those who start in 2-year colleges, also amongst the lowest success rates in the country. For Native Americans, also amongst the lowest in the country. So no matter how you cut the data on college going and college completion, there are reasons to be alarmed, and that goes for white students as well. Even again, among associate's programs, New Mexico has one of the lowest rates, and rates are particularly low for kids of color. Put all this together, and what do you end up with? A workforce that is vastly undereducated compared to workforces elsewhere in the country, with one of the lowest rates here of young adults with at least an associate's degree. So as you think about that, the question is, all right, you got some traction. Your early reading numbers are starting to head in the right direction. Your high school graduation rates are starting to head in the right direction. You have some of the nicest improvement in the country in 8th grade math. So the question for you is, how do we take both what we've learned and what we can learn from elsewhere and double down? Because unless we become number one in improvement, we're not going to get where we need to go. So let me wrap up by running you through what we think of as a kind of top-line lessons from those who are ahead of the rest of us and getting better results. So number one, and I think this is probably very clear in what I talked about when I was talking about the individual schools, that good schools and school districts, the ones that are really on a strong improvement trajectory, don't leave anything about either teaching or learning to chance. What do I mean by that? All too often in this country, a lot of our teachers, including people who are brand new to the profession, are pretty much left on their own to figure out what to teach, the order in which they should teach it, or, most important, what work is good enough. So if I'm a brand new 4th grade teacher, what kind of writing is actually good enough for an A, B, or C? If I'm a brand new 7th grade math teacher, what kind of mathematical understanding is good enough for that A, B, or C? Most of those decisions are still left to individual teachers to figure out on their own. So when you do that, what happens? Basically, we know from long experience what happens, and that is if who's in the classroom is mostly poor or mostly of color, the decisions about what's good enough writing or what's good enough mathematics just always get watered down. Now, there's a lot of research on that, but frankly, our experience and insight into that comes a lot more from the work our staff does in actual classrooms every day. And while we're there to help teachers who are struggling to get better results actually get those better results, we cannot help but notice the difference between what's asked in high-poverty schools and all the rest. And that is, what kind of assignments do kids get day in and day out? And we have been stunned by how little still we expect of poor kids. Just to give you 2 examples. What I'm showing you here is 2 assignments from 10th grade college prep English classes in 2 high schools, the first a low poverty school, the second a high poverty school. Just to give you an example of how this plays out. So if you wouldn't mind, just read through that assignment, and as you do, just think a little bit about, okay, what would a student have to do to get an A on that assignment? And I want you to hold that in your head. So what's the work involved in getting an A on that assignment? And hold that on your head. We're going to go across town to the high poverty school, and I'm going to show you a typical assignment there in a 10th grade so-called college prep class. You don't have to look at that very long to see the difference, right? Let me show you another example. This is what a writing assignment typically looks like in a low poverty school for 7th graders. This is the kind of actual work the teachers are asking of their children. Unfortunately, when you go to a high poverty 7th grade classroom, this is what a writing assignment often looks like. You don't have to think about those very long to know what a difference they make. And I know some of you are saying to yourself, well, maybe they're just showing the best assignment they ever saw from a high wealth school, or the worst assignment they ever saw from a high poverty school. You'll have to take my word for it. That's not what we're doing here. What we're basically find is if you take and pile up all the assignments that kids get during a given academic year, what you find is that we have one set of kids in this country who get a pretty steady diet of assignments that look like the first one in each of those sequences, assignments that push, that build, that challenge. And we have another set of kids in this country who get a pretty steady flow of assignments that look at best like the second ones in each of those series. And I say at best because in between those, there are a lot of coloring assignments and collage assignments and dioramas, okay? You don't have to think about that very long to know how huge a difference that makes for the kids. So let me be clear here. High-performing schools and districts do not let that happen. What do? They know, for example, that new standards, even really good standards like the Common Core standards, don't teach themselves, right? You can't just hand teachers those standards and say, here, you figure it out, because they'll do the same things they've always done. And they will, in the end, dumb it down for some groups of kids. So those high performers know they need to drop down below those and get very, very specific and clear in guiding teachers on what kids should learn at every grade level, including the order in which they should learn it. They know they need to provide teachers with common curriculum and assignments, so they don't have to make it up for themselves, because frankly, our teachers don't want to, and they're not very good at it. Number 3, they need and they create regular vehicles to assure that teachers who are teaching same subject and grade level actually have a common understanding of what good enough looks like, and a common understanding of good assignments look like. They're they're assessing kids regularly along the way to measure progress, and most important, they don't leave any of this, especially student supports, to chance. When you visit a high-performing, high-poverty school and you ask, okay, what happens when kids are struggling to master a standard during the year? And you ask any 8 adults, in high-performing schools, all 8 give you the same answer. In low-performing schools, each gives you a different answer. That does not mean the high-performing school is working harder. What it means is they've figured out together, okay, what they're going to do when kids are struggling, and they don't wait on the kids. So they don't put supports after school and just hope the kids take them. They build them in very deliberate ways. They monitor who's taking advantage, and they make sure the kids who aren't are actually connecting with those supports. It is about striving for consistency in everything they do, and by the way, that includes school discipline. So as you think about your Common Core implementation efforts, it's really important that you remember it's not standards themselves are not good enough, and ask yourself the question, what kind of supports do your teachers need to have in order to avoid having to make this up for themselves? And what do you need to do differently in schools or in individual classrooms where the aims have been lower, where what's constituted a good assignment just looks so low level? What do you need to do differently so those teachers, too, are aiming at the same standard? So it's about harnessing these powerful new standards we have. I mean, these are powerful tools, and we start in such a good place because teachers say, finally, you're focusing on the right things instead of the dumb things. So we got that going for us now, but we've got to come in underneath it with real concrete supports for teachers as they try to swing their practice in these new directions. 2, speaking of teachers, in good schools and districts, they don't just say over and over again, yeah, teachers matter more than anything else. What's different about these schools is they act on that knowledge. So why is that important? You all certainly know that we now have roughly 15 years of data that is telling us that there are much bigger differences among our teachers in their ability to take kids from wherever they are when they enter a classroom and grow their knowledge and skills than we ever knew. So I know, we've always known that there were some differences, and in our roles as parents, many of us have acted on those differences to maneuver our own children into Mrs. So-and-so's classroom and not this other classroom. So we know that from experience. But as professionals, we've often taken a very different approach. When parents come in and say that, we say, oh no, don't worry. Your child will learn whatever he or she needs to learn from every teacher in our building. That, it turns out to be a gigantic lie. A gigantic lie. Because there are not just small differences amongst our teachers, there are very, very big differences amongst our teachers and their ability to grow kids. Some of our teachers, year in and year out, no matter what kind of kids are sitting in front of them, take their kids from wherever they are way up, and another set of our teachers, year in and year out, take our kids literally no place at all. What you're seeing in this slide from Dallas shows you one example of how those differences play out. Again, the kind of growth that kids make when they're in a low effectiveness teacher's classroom compared to growth in a high effectiveness teacher's classroom. This study from Los Angeles may show the differences even more powerfully. What they learned is that the top quarter of teachers in Los Angeles are producing 6 months more learning during a given academic year than teachers in the bottom quarter. Let me repeat that again. In Los Angeles, teachers in the top quarter of effectiveness are producing roughly 6 months more learning during a given academic year than teachers in the bottom quarter. And let me be clear, those differences matter hugely to our kids. And you can see that in this slide from Los Angeles. What you see in the first grade chair there is a child who enters third grade at the below basic level. And those 3 gold chairs show you what happens to that child's performance if they have 3 bottom quartile teachers in a row. Below basic, stays at below basic, stays at below basic, stays at below basic. The blue chairs show you, by contrast, what happens to that child if he or she has 3 top quarter teachers in a row. In 1 year alone, close to proficient. In the second year, above the proficiency bar. And in the third year, well on the way to advanced. So these are not minor, insignificant differences. These are big, life-changing differences. So there are very big differences amongst our teachers, but there's 2 very important buts. We pretend that they aren't. So when it comes to evaluation, as all you know, the history in this country has been, we basically tell all teachers they're exactly the same. Whether you've got 2 rating levels on your rating system or you've got 3 rating levels on your rating system, that the vast majority of our teachers have been told every single year that they're exactly the same. And as I showed you earlier, there's a second but. So the big differences amongst our teachers, but we pretend that they aren't. And no matter how you measure them, no matter how we systematically assign the kids who most need our best teachers to our weakest. And again, that's true no matter how you look at the data. Whether you look at who's being taught by novices, who's being taught by out-of-field teachers, or who's being taught by the teachers who are strongest and who are weakest. And actually, when you step back from all the studies, and as you probably know by now, there's been like a jillion studies here, the overwhelming message is clear. If you ask the question every fall, who are the children in America who are most likely to be assigned to our weakest teachers? The answer is initially low-achieving kids. So rather than doing what both common sense and common decency would suggest, and that is when kids are right behind, we should just rush to them, our strongest teachers who can catch them up quickly, we actually do exactly the opposite. So we got to stop doing that. We got to get honest in giving teachers the feedback they need to get better. We've got to get honest and aggressive about finding ways to take our strongest teachers and use them to help other teachers get better. We got to get honest about making sure that poor kids and kids of color get at least their fair share of our strongest teachers. And we got to get honest that some of our teachers, even with help, won't ever get good enough for our kids. And those teachers need help to find other employment. So it's about taking seriously this sacred obligation of ours to take all of our children and advance them to the very limits of their potential. So teachers matter a lot. Third, it's also, though, about not just saying, oh, we have these new curriculum standards and hoping kids will learn what they need to learn. It's about making sure that all of our kids are in a rigorous course-taking sequence that actually prepares them to do well and meet those standards, but for post-secondary education as well. You know, we've got a lot of data now that tells us unequivocally that the single biggest predictor of how students do in higher education is not their ACT or SAT score, not their rank in class, not their GPA, but the quality and intensity of the high school curriculum. When kids get a rigorous sequence of high school courses that push them toward college preparation, they will succeed no matter what kind of college they go to. When, by contrast, they have a weak high school curriculum, they will not succeed no matter what college they go to. But the important thing to know is that same curriculum that we've always called the college prep curriculum has benefits far beyond just college preparation. Students of all sorts, frankly, including those who come in at the low end in 9th grade, actually do better if we put them in a college prep course than if we put them in a remedial course that we've designed to catch them up. Why might that be? It might be, as the mathematician Uri Treisman said not so long ago, it might be because Americans are the only people who believe you can actually catch kids up by slowing them down. What we've been doing is pretending that we can catch kids up by slowing them down in a remedial course when the reality tells us that they'll actually be more likely to catch up if we put them in the college prep course to begin with support on the side. But they will also fail less often when we put them in the tougher courses than in the easier courses, and they'll be better prepared for the workplace as well. And again, speaking of both preparation for college and careers in both Common Core and non-Common Core states, college readiness for all is the new goal, not because we think necessarily that all kids will go on, especially to four-year colleges, but it's because of that sacred obligation that we have, and that is to prepare all students so at the end of high school they can make a choice, as opposed to us making the choice for them. So the question for you is, do your course requirements for high school graduation line up with that goal and line up with your standards or not? And if not, it's really important to get busy. Speaking of high goals, leading schools and school districts set their goals high. You saw the elementary version when I showed you earlier that in the high-performing schools, principals and teachers are not satisfied with their kids just hitting proficient level on state assessments. They consistently aim for advanced. And when they're asked, well, why are you aiming at advanced? Their response is pretty straightforward. And that is, if we aim at advanced, proficient will take care of itself, won't it? Fairly simple idea. It turns out to be powerful in practice. But the same is true at the high school level. You know, one of the biggest worries I have from this effort to produce finally public data on high school graduation rates that's actually honest is that as I look around the country, high school level educators are freaking out. They're going, oh my heavens, don't push the little babies, don't challenge them, don't make them take the tougher courses because they'll get discouraged and our dropout rates will go up, not down. But the truth of the matter is, when you look around the country and you ask the question, what are the high schools doing that are actually reducing their dropout rates, but also improving the rates at which their students are prepared for what happens after high school? None of them are doing that by dumbing down their requirements. Instead of asking students to hit the minimum that's necessary for a high school diploma, they demand they take the tougher courses, but provide support along the way. And by the way, the leaders in these schools do not think about closing the achievement gap, just as bringing the bottom up. And I want to stop and make one special comment about that. You know, one of the sidelines that has come about as a result of No Child Left Behind is that a whole lot of educators think, when they're talking about closing the achievement gap, that this is mostly about just bringing bottom achieving kids up. There's been a good effect of that. The good effect of that is our bottom kids are coming up. And when you look at, as I showed you, the number of kids performing in that dangerous red category is going down, 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 down. But you don't have to think about this very long, and you're numbers people, so you know this. You can't close achievement gaps just by bringing the bottom kids up. We got to move our middle kids to higher still, and we got to take our top kids higher still. And that is what we are not getting at. Over the last 10 years, we have made dramatic progress as a country in moving our white kids into the advanced category on national tests. But look, by contrast, at progress for our Latino students. We are not closing achievement gaps that way, my friends. It's about both moving kids from the bottom up, but about moving the middle and the high part higher still. It's about helping all of our kids to grow to realize their potential. I talked about teachers, but let me be clear what you already know from your own experience, and that is you can get none of this done without focusing intently on developing your principals, both your current principals and those who will take their places. When you visit the high-performing schools, in every single case, principals are ever present. But what's really important to know is that they are not the only leaders in their school. You know, one of the things that happens every year is there are conventions of principals, and those conventions often have keynote presentations by these principals who tell the story of how they turn the school around by the sheer force of their personality. I always get very aggravated in sessions like that for two reasons. One is because when you see these big outsized personalities make presentations of that sort, everybody else who's sitting in the audience, the rest of us go, well, geez, if that's what it takes, I don't have that, so I guess I can't do this work. But the second reason I get upset is that we probably spend more time as an organization in high-performing, high-poverty schools than all other organizations put together. And we have never once come across a principal like the ones you hear at the conventions. In every case, these are ordinary people. What's different about them is not their big outsized personality. They are ordinary people doing extraordinary work because they are extraordinarily good at building a team and giving leadership roles to others in the building. I talked with you about Elmont Memorial is probably the gold standard of what that looks like, where the improvement task is not just the principal and the assistant principals, but shared at least equally by the teacher leaders in that building. That's what good looks like. And we need to assure that the principals we're preparing have that kind of skill, because it's about drive, yes, it's about never giving up, it's about relentlessness, but it is also fundamentally about building a team and helping that team to get ever better over time. So one thing in closing, I realize there are people here in the room who are from outside of education, and I will apologize for having spent the vast majority of my time on those inside, but that's the vast majority of this room. For you outside, though, one simple request, and that is when you look at data on your local community and you see numbers that concern you, either about the achievement of all kids or about the achievement of some groups of kids, it doesn't help if you just ignore it. It doesn't help if you excuse it based on how challenging the kids are. It helps if you create demand for change. You help create the demand for change by pointing to successes elsewhere and by pressing for similar results. Leaders need leverage, right? They need wind behind their backs, not just in their faces. And they get that not from a community that just explains away low performance, but from one that demands progress, that demands growth. Yes, that may make you annoying, but my request to you is be annoying, because in so doing, you'll provide leverage to the people in this room who are doing the work and who need that leverage to do it further, faster, better for your kids. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. I hope we're going to open it up for some questions and answer time. I want to take a couple minutes. I will tell you, I've known Katie for about 10 years. And I can tell you that every time I have a conversation with her or hear her speak, it is a reminder, first to me, of there are no excuses, it can be done. And I believe that New Mexico, based on the data we saw, on the one hand, it's you can get discouraged for a moment, but you could also look and say there's some really good growth going on, and we're seeing some real movement, and be encouraged. We can also be encouraged because, to me, I heard 6 themes in what Katie said. Number 1, standards and expectations matter. Number 2, teachers and school leaders are game changers, and that would be 2 and 3 in some ways. Rigorous curriculum where we see the working together and those really high expectations that are consistent from school to school, from district to district. And a closing with the no excuses, and it takes all of our communities to make this happen. And many of you have been in education your whole life and have served in your community or in different communities around this state your whole life. I can tell you, I have the privilege of visiting. I visited almost all our districts. I've got a few left, and what I see is communities coming together. And I do want to take a minute before we open it for questions and answers, and to that end, thank once again Jed Fanning here representing the Albuquerque Chamber, but I also want to acknowledge others that are in our communities that are standing with you and us to see more and more of these possibilities for our kids. And just quickly, if you would stand, I want to acknowledge Terry Cole is here with the Albuquerque Chamber. I believe she may have had to step out. I don't see her at this very moment. Our statewide, is she here? Great, oh good, here she is, she's in the back, she's in black. Thank you, Terry, a true advocate for education, not just here in Albuquerque, she also leads our statewide chamber association, so all your communities work, and their executive directors work with Terry. Our head of our PTA, statewide PTA, is here. I want to just acknowledge the importance of our parent-teacher associations. Alex Romero with our Hispano Chamber here as executive director. Patty Comco, executive director of Leadership New Mexico. I will acknowledge that Patty is the discoverer of Katie. She brings Katie every year before statewide leaders to bring this data and information to become productively inspired to be a part of change in education, to come alongside each one of you in your communities, and so we're grateful for that, Patty. Also Carrie Mitchell, president of Las Cruces Machinery, and part of the Employability Partnership Leadership Board here statewide. Dale Decker, also here in Albuquerque, part of the Chamber and Employability Partnership and Leadership statewide. So just many people across our state saying, we want to support education. These are folks that hold me accountable as well and say, what are you doing to prepare and stand along to make sure our students are ready for success, whether in college or career. So I thank you for your leadership and your accountability as well. But I hope as you leave, you don't leave with a sense of, wow, we've got to go back to our schools and make this happen by ourselves. You are making it happen, and I hope you go back knowing you've got communities around you that are supporting you, standing with you, and want to say, no excuses, it can be done, but we're with you, how can we help as we move forward?